Welcome to the Career Success Secret Show. I am your host, Mike Tomasello. I have a very special guest for you today. He originally grew up in India, but he is now in the United States. He's been a top team leader at top tier companies, including Bloomberg, Amazon, and now he's an engineering hiring manager over at Google. He has an MBA from NYU Stern. I'm very excited to welcome Vineet. Welcome, Vineet. How are you feeling today?
Thanks for the warm introduction and welcome, Mike. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing absolutely amazing. I'm excited. One of the reasons why I wanted to invite you today is I feel like we never get the nitty gritty from the hiring manager's perspective in terms of what's really going on behind the scenes in the hiring process. And I think we're going to jump in there, and I think it's going to be eye-opening for a lot of people out there. Sound good? Awesome. I want you to imagine at the top tier companies that you've worked at over the years, the average position that's opened underneath your team, or on average, how many applicants per position do you know of that are applying for a lot of the positions that you've posted?
On an average, I would say probably it's in hundreds. I don't remember the exact number, but maybe 400 to 500. It also depends on was it for a specific team or is it like a general pool? But yeah, in my experience, a few hundreds is what I've seen.
Got it. And when people apply for positions, how many of those resumes do you actually look at versus how many does the recruiter look at?
It's probably impractical for any hiring manager to go through all the hundreds of resumes. So we do partner with recruiters for sourcing and screening the candidates. So they do most of the screening. They first discuss with us about the job requirements and all. And then probably out of the hundreds, I would see a few dozen.
Got it. So you might see a few dozen, and so you said approximately 200 to 300 people might apply for a position. Do you see those 10 to 12 resumes? Do you see those before the recruiter starts interviewing them or after the recruiter starts interviewing them? How does that usually go with the recruiters you've worked with?
Usually after the recruiter has interviewed them, because that's where the screening happens. So they make sure that we don't talk to people who may not be a good fit. So they do the initial screening.
Got it. So my guess is they find 10 to 12 people that are pretty exceptional, but I'm assuming it's possible that, there might be a 13th grade candidate or a 14th grade candidate or a 15th grade candidate that you don't necessarily see or interview because the recruiter can only interview so many people. Would that be accurate?
Yes.
Awesome. So the recruiter shows you 10 to 12 candidates that they think are great, that they've spoken to. How many of those do you usually choose to interview yourself on average?
I would say at least 50%. Yeah, sometimes you feel that the initial resume looks good, but you're looking for a specific skill set that's lacking. So some of those get filtered out. But yeah, I would say about half.
Got it. So I have an interesting question that just popped into my head. Let's say that someone from NYU, where you went to school for your MBA, let's say that someone from NYU emailed you, complete stranger, but they went to the same school as you. They emailed you and said, "Hey, I also work in software engineering, and I'm a good fit for the position because of X, Y, and Z reason. Here's my resume." How would you react to an email like that?
It might also depend on the hiring supply demand situation, right? If we are looking for a candidate for a really long time, and if we haven't found any, then I would definitely entertain such. If we already have a dozens of candidates, then I would probably still look at the email, but there is no guarantee that just because we share the same college that those candidates will get a preference.
Of course, sure. But if they appear to have a really great background, would you consider potentially interviewing them or at least having the HR manager take a closer look at them and interview them themselves?
Yes, we prefer to keep the recruiters in the loop. So even if the candidate directly interacted with us, if I find the application interesting, I would ask them to reach out to the recruiter. I would tell the recruiter that, hey, this candidate I want to kind of proceed with, please consider the application and do the initial screening call. So that way recruiter, I don't want to sideline the recruiter. We are usually partners in that. But yeah, it's not that unless the recruiter has initiated it, like there is no chance.
Great. I like that. I think it's smart to partner with your recruiter and leverage that as much as possible. I want to talk about networking for a little bit. Let's say that, someone wants to work, someone's interested in learning more about a company that you've worked for in the past, or someone's interested in learning more about advancing in their engineering career, or or a career that overlaps with what you do. Do you do networking? How would someone build an effective relationship with you?
That's an interesting question. So I do networking. I think networking is essential. It's not just like a nice to have, but it's important. But I do it for my own career, as in like to build relationship where I could offer some value and hopefully in return, in case ever I need. So the way I network is I have a connection with the college that I graduated from, not NYU, but my MS in CS. I did it from Binghamton University, which is a college in upstate New York. So I maintain relationships with professors over there, and I occasionally go on campus, talk to students. So I know that if I'm looking for a junior level position, then I could rely on the professors to suggest some recommendations. So that I have personally done the most, but I do occasionally also go to some conferences and talk to people. But that is little less. I'm a little less active on that front than talking to my professors and talking to the students from Binghamton University.
Yeah, I love the fact that you brought that up, because so many people don't talk about that stuff. So you listening at home in the audience, or while you're riding your exercise bike or whatever, um, I think it's important to note that some hiring managers do go back and talk to some of their best professors. And so many students don't keep in touch or build relationships with their professors. So I love the fact you said that. The other part is, yeah, you go to conferences. And so I'm not saying that you should only go to a conference to get in good with the hiring manager, but there are hiring managers that are going to conferences and that are looking to network and build relationships themselves. So I think those are great tips that you shared. I'd love for you to go into more detail in terms of, why do you network? How do you network, you personally? And for someone that like completely doesn't know what networking means, or maybe they have a bad definition of it, what would you recommend, and use personal examples as much as possible?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think networking has played a humongous role in my career. If I remember correctly, at least three of my four jobs in the US I got because of networking. And so uh, that's what I tell others also. The most important thing here, or at least in my opinion, is that you should network before you need it, right? If you're looking for a job, that is not the ideal time to kind of start building new connections. You should talk to people beforehand, and not in a transactional way that, hey, I do this for you, you do this for me. Like you try to build genuine relationships, try to showcase your expertise, try to see what they bring to table, try to see what you can bring to table, and help them in a preferably in a selfless way, right? Like you just help out, or you just meet somebody who share common interest, you talk about that, and then see how things go, right? I understand that it is impractical to do that with everybody, right? There are only a handful of people and you cannot apply the same strategy with everybody. But you can at least identify a few key players in from different angles, right? One is if you're already working, one of the things I've seen people not focusing too much on is network within that company. People could leave. If you have a good impression with them, if you have good relationship with them, that could be a great resource to explore further. Then another thing is, like, as we are talking about, if you're a student, networking with professors have huge alumni network connection, right? So getting good GPA, creating good impression on professors is not, I have not seen a lot of people kind of following that. And then third is joining social media, right? Or any kind of, let's say, open source contributions or social media where you interact with people, you showcase your expertise, you help them in some way, you offer some kind of value without much in return. And that's how you kind of slowly build a relationship, so that when the time comes, you should not feel uncomfortable asking for a favor, or the other person should not feel that, oh, or they should feel comfortable offering it even without you asking.
Love it. I think that's great advice. I'd love to hear. I'm just super curious myself, and I think it'll be useful for the audience. I recommend people do as many of those things that you just mentioned as possible. And I'm kind of curious, like, how did that translate to the 3 out of the 4 job opportunities that you've had? Um, were they, were they friends of friends? Did you meet these people through former coworkers? Did you meet them online? And if so, where and how? Could you pick one or two of those and sort of give us a bit more detail in terms of what that looks like?
Yeah, I'll talk about Bloomberg and Amazon. Right? So in Bloomberg, I was in college in Binghamton University doing my master's, and one of my friends was already placed. He was, I think, a semester ahead of me, and he was placed in Bloomberg. I had also given an interview, but I did not clear it on the first go. Bloomberg had a policy that if you apply and if you don't clear, you have to wait for one more year. However, this friend happened to be also my project partner. So he knew that I was a hard worker. I had the necessary skills. It was, call it luck, lack of preparation, whatever. That did not work in my favor from the first time. So he was on the team that used to come for recruiting. So I asked him that, is there anything I could do to showcase that I'm still a good fit and I could interview earlier than next year? So he talked to the hiring manager and he vouched for me, mainly not because he was my friend, because obviously his reputation was also on the line, but because he had good experience with me as a project partner. He knew my skills, he knew my work ethic. I got an opportunity to interview within 6 months instead of 1 year. So that was a huge thing because who knows what would have happened after a year, right? So that's how I got my second chance and I made sure that I capitalize on that. So I got my offer from Bloomberg when I was a master's student. So that was the first thing. And then the second, when I was in Bloomberg, I used to work with a colleague and we worked on a couple of projects and we went through some ups and downs, but I made sure that I don't give emphasis only on the project delivery, but also on the people side, like making sure that his requirements are taken into consideration, his timelines and people are taken into consideration. So over the period, I built good relationship with him. Then he transferred to Amazon. And then out of a sudden, he reached out to me saying that he knows a hiring manager who is looking for somebody and he thought I would be a good fit. So that way, I didn't even have to apply. Like literally the opportunity landed in my lap. By opportunity, I don't mean the job offer, but even the interview opportunity that a lot of people struggle with. Like they apply and the application doesn't go anywhere. Whereas here, I actually got a chance when I was not looking to interview with such a company. And I fortunately, at that time, I got the offer on that attempt. So I did not let him down, but it was, this is how they like twice. And then the third was also Google, but we can talk about that later if you have time.
That's awesome. I love those stories. Do you want to share that third story?
Yeah, sure. So for Google, I had applied through one of my friends. So I got a call and that was kind of fine. But similar to my experience with Bloomberg, even I did not succeed on my first attempt at Google. And that is standard. So that's I'm putting a little sidebar, but if any of our listeners are interested in applying to Google, one of the important things is to remember that a lot of people who got into Google did not get in on their first attempt. So it is okay to keep trying and not lose hope. So that was coming back to my story. So on my first attempt, I did not clear. I was fortunate enough to receive some feedback from the recruiter. Uh, it depends on luck. Sometimes they share, sometimes they don't. But this time they stated that my technical was not a problem, but the behavioral interviews, I did not give answers that convinced them that was a level appropriate answer. So there are different individual contributor or manager levels. And when they are hiring, they're expecting certain kind of demonstration in your previous experience. So I took that as a feedback. And then I tried to see that, okay, what my answers were lacking, because behavioral interviews, there is no right or wrong answer, right? It is which project you kind of focus on or what incidents you focus on. So I kind of reconciled all that feedback. I tried to see which examples made sense. At that time, I also had made an internal transfer to Amazon, which would give me those opportunities. And then I reached out to my network to kind of who were at the level that I was interviewing for, to kind of discuss with them that, hey, I stated or I gave this as an example. Do you think that this other example would have been a better thing? And then I got feedback from them that they are already at that level. So yes, this is what they would have expected. And then I incorporated that in my second attempt and I cleared that. So having that network, and I reached out to at least 2 or 3 people from my time I think one of them was from Amazon, two of them from Bloomberg, because I had good professional relationship with them when I was working. I could reach out to them. I did not reach out to them asking for a referral, but hey, I want to run these things by you. Like, do you think that this is a level appropriate answer, or should I be talking about something else, right? So that tremendously helped me in making sure that I structured my answers in a way that they sound level appropriate and use the right examples to kind of highlight and showcase my skills.
Awesome. I love that. I want to talk a little bit about the differences between a candidate that gets successfully hired by a smaller company versus a candidate that gets successfully hired by, the big names. So a lot of people want to work for the Google and Amazons and FANG companies of the world, or Bloombergs. And regardless of the number of people that are applying per position, I can guarantee you, listening in the audience, that the number of people applying is dramatically more at the Googles of the world, the Amazons, the Bloombergs, etc. And so, Vineet, what do you think? What do you think the difference is between people that are super successful in terms of both getting interviews at top tier companies? There's a lot of people out there, like the average person out there isn't necessarily Google caliber or Amazon caliber, or maybe they're not putting in the effort in the job search process in order to stand out. And so, what advice would you give the average job searcher? Like, where do they need to step up their game? What can they be doing to show that they're a superstar and deserving of working at a top tier company? Any advice in that realm would be really helpful.
Yeah. So for big companies, I think the one thing that is different from small is they have a very rigid interview structure, right? So and I'm talking specifically from the technical aspect, but I'm sure that this applies to other positions also. There are certain specific expectations or interview rounds. Like for example, for software developer position, the big companies will have online assessment where they will have to solve some coding questions. Then they will have coding rounds in house, and then they will have system design and then behavioral interviews. Knowing that what is the interview process and expectations from this of this company is really important, because a lot of time people just assume that, hey, I'm going to talk about my resume, and then they go unprepared, right? So preparation is not just about knowing how to solve a problem, but also understanding the expectations of the company and preparing accordingly, right? So for technical positions, do your homework, make sure that you understand what is expected of you, and you practice that in advance. You should not leave anything for luck or just be explaining your previous experience. Now, but the first part is like, how do you even get that interview, right? I think networking plays a big role. Like if you already have some experience and if you already know some people, because as I was saying before, you have hundreds of applications. How do you kind of stand out? One option is having a resume, which is like so awesome to ignore. But what does that mean, right? Sometimes it could be subjective. Sometimes you can put skills, or if you have those skills that are exactly matching the job requirement, that could kind of help you. But emphasizing impact and complexity is, I think, what makes a difference. A lot of people, again, talking about technical example, people look at YouTube videos of, hey, build a to-do list, right? Or build a YouTube clone. Those are very common examples, right? Show me something that makes me believe that, hey, you are not just copy pasting some code, you are solving some right or real practical problem, right? And then explain some of the complexities. So not just that, hey, I built this application, but why or how it helped, who it helped, right? And provide some metric. So seeing some resume which has some really complex or good projects, impactful projects, is one way. That may or may not be sufficient. Again, if you're having hundreds of applicants and if the recruiter is going to initially screen, the recruiter may not understand or assess that the complexity or relevance of that particular project, then you're out of luck. That's where networking comes into picture, right? So if you have a solid network, if you have already built a network in advance, communicated your expertise, help people on some of the projects, you could kind of short circuit that and say that, okay, please consider my application because I've already worked on so many awesome things.
Got it. So we're going to pause right here for a second, but I do want to come back and talk about the networking piece a little bit more. Then I want to circle back and talk about interviewing a little bit more. But before I do that, I want to make sure that people can benefit from your knowledge in the future, that they can know where to follow you. If people want to follow you, where should they go?
I'm most active on Twitter or X. My handle is VJS, so VJ's Insights. And I also have a YouTube channel with the same handle. I'm less active on YouTube, but I do plan to resurrect that at some point in the near future.
Great.
But thanks for mentioning that.
VJ's Insight.
Correct.
Awesome.
Insights. Yeah.
Insights. Thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's head back to the networking piece. So, you said something earlier in our conversation. You said networking is best if you do it before you actually need it, which I totally agree with. And sometimes people are learning networking for the first time when they waited too long because they didn't know any better, and now they need it. So it's tempting for a job searcher to be just like, oh, it's too late to do networking. I didn't do it before I needed it because I didn't know. So I just won't bother to network. What would you say to someone who thinks like that?
What is that saying? The best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The second best time is now, right? Like, I think that applies in this case also. Yes, ideally you should have done that before, but that doesn't mean that it's now too late. You will probably have to send cold emails way more than otherwise, but it's never too late. Like, send those cold emails, make sure that you do some research about the person that you're sending to, make sure you got their name right. Like, don't just send a generic template. Don't just send that, hey, please refer me to whichever position you see fit. Take some effort on your part, and then show them that you are putting some effort. Like, maybe mention a thing or two about them from their LinkedIn page, that why you think that, what do you share in common, and why you could be a better fit for a specific position, etc. And then on the side, you can still start building those long-term relationships, right? I'll give you one specific example. Like, you probably know Ankush, who has something called Real Dev Squad. And again, apologies for giving tech-specific example, but most of my experience has been, and like, people I know are from tech, so I'm kind of harping on that. But the common concepts apply in any field. So Ankush has Real Dev Squad, which is a community of developers. They build real life applications. So people who contribute in that community, who actually build applications, Ankush is going to notice that this is a good developer, right? And if they tell Ankush that, hey, I'm looking for a job now, because I trust Ankush, if I hear from Ankush that, hey, this person is a solid developer, give them a chance, I'm not going to think twice, right? So see what fits better for you. Just because I said Real Dev Squad doesn't mean that you have to go in that, but find some community, find some way to showcase your expertise and deliver value, right? If you're just networking is not sending LinkedIn message saying that, hey, I need a job, right? That does not work that effectively. So what can you do sustainably, consistently, and how you can add value? So you focus on that on the side, but don't lose hope. Like, keep sending the cold DMs, but make sure that you put in some effort in that.
Awesome. All good stuff. I'll probably talk about this in a future episode. I'm personally not the biggest fan of cold emails, but hey, if it's working for someone, absolutely do it. Outreach to some people is better than outreach to nobody, but I love the fact that you're giving people actions where they can take some action and do something with it to get started. The twist I would put on it, for those of you that have a degree of any sorts, could be a bachelor's degree, you are part of an alumni network. And so if you're not jumping on LinkedIn every single time and seeing if there's an alum that works at the companies you're interested in, seeing the alums that work in your field, whether it be software engineering or development or something different, whatever your field is, or seeing if you have an alum that works in your town. Maybe you came from an out of country or an out of city university, you should still be doing that search anyway. I was working with a friend of mine. She became a client who was from not even one of the largest cities in Venezuela. And she was in a small town in, I'm not going to say what state, But she was in a less populous state in the United States. And I said, hey, let's do this search. There were 7 people from her university living in her small town. I'm talking like a city of 300,000 people. It wasn't even in the millions. So don't assume that you don't have a network, because almost everybody does. And I see you're nodding. Is there anything you want to add to that before we switch over to interviewing?
Not add, but agree with you on two things. Like, I'm also not a big fan of cold emails, right? Like, I would, if anybody send me a cold email, most likely I'm going to ignore that unless I have some connection with that person. But as you're saying that if you don't have any other option, then okay, go with that, because some people do acknowledge and respond to that. So, but yeah, that's also not my preferred way. But when I said that, going back to again your point, that try, it's impossible. You're not going to send LinkedIn messages to millions of people, right? So finding these common threads about like sharing either the city, sharing some kind of college or something is important. That way you at least, and of course in the domain, that is important so that you can narrow the focus and be more effective rather than just sending same blanket email to everybody.
Got it. And Vineet, you said something really important that I want to say again for the audience, and that was, even though Vineet is a software engineering manager, even though some of this stuff we're talking about is technical or software development, like 90%, if not 99% of what we're talking about has a practical application for almost every field in almost every industry. So if if you don't find value in the technical interview portion that we're talking about, then ignore that portion. But I would consider taking notes on all of this, because there's a way to adapt just about every tip that you're giving for everyone. Amazing, amazing stuff thus far. Let's talk about interviewing a little bit more. And so let's primarily think. First of all, and this might be different at the different companies. So there's a behavioral interview or a traditional interview that some people might call it. And then if you're technically inclined or an engineer, there's almost always a technical interview portion of it. Do you, as hiring manager, do you conduct 2 different types of interviews? Do you ever get involved in the technical interview? Tell us briefly about that.
Yeah. So in Amazon, I did both behavioral interviews and I also did some technical interviews.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. Well, let's focus on the traditional or the behavioral interviewing type of stuff. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see with the people that actually make it to the interview round? So they're good enough to get an interview on paper, and they're coming in and they're making common mistakes anyway. What would like one your top 3 of those be?
Got it. Yeah. So not structuring your response in a cohesive way, right? Usually we recommend like STAR or SBI. So STAR stands for situation, task, action, result, or SBI, situation, behavior, impact, right? So explaining your answer in that way so that it sounds coherent, and you have limited time, right? So you cannot just blabber. So you need to make conscious effort of how much time you're spending on each of those points. And I think the impact part is really important. People want to understand what you bring to the table. So they want to know what impact you made that could potentially be transferable skill in this particular job. Second thing I've seen is people not talking too much about their specific contribution, right? Oh, our team did this. Oh, we did this. We built this, which is great, but this is not exactly the time to play super modest, right? Like you don't need to lie and you don't need to exaggerate, but you need to focus on your specific contribution because that's what the interviewer is trying to assess. And then the third part is assumptions. Like, don't assume that this is what the interviewer wants, right? If you have a doubt that are they looking for this or this, ask them. Like, you don't, as soon as the interviewer finishes, doesn't mean that you have to start exactly at that point, right? It is completely okay to take a moment to think about some example that perfectly fits that particular situation, or ask clarification or ask follow-up question to the interviewer. So make sure that you are not treating it as, okay, they are done and I need to just start and keep talking.
Awesome. I love that. There was so much useful information in there. I'm going to try to pull out a couple pieces that I heard. So one, I heard something about being more intentional and structuring your answers, because one of the one of the common objectives, and I'd love to get your reaction to the common objection. One of the common objections I hear from people is, well, I don't want to prepare too much, or I don't want to write out my answers because I'm afraid I'm going to come off as inauthentic or overly rehearsed or stuff like that. And what I'm hearing from you, which I completely agree with, is if you don't do any intentional thinking, especially if you don't interview a lot, it's almost impossible to structure your answer in a way where you can feel confident that it's being effective. Any thoughts to those people? Anything that you would add to that for someone who says, "Oh, I'm not going to think out my answer ahead of time"? What would you say to those people?
I agree with everything that you just said, Mike, and I'll also elaborate a little bit on why. Right, interview time is very stressful. Right, like no matter what you say, you are going to be under pressure, and in that time, thinking about a relevant or the most impactful example on the fly, and then explaining that in a concise manner is really difficult. Right, I personally was not able to do that, like even after interviewing for so many times. And I did exactly what you said. I had a bulleted list of all the data points of all the projects that I wanted to mention. You can do a Google search on behavioral questions, right? There are only a few dozen, or maybe top 100. Like, you're not going to be more than that. But you going back to your point, like unless you put that effort, you are going to tax your brain during the interview to come up with the best possible example. And you want to reduce that friction so that you can focus on the most important stuff, is explaining and highlighting your contributions.
I love that. I love that. Super important. Well, we covered an awful lot of ground today. I want to do a little experiment with you. Pretend that you quit your job tomorrow. What would you do immediately? What would be your plan? What actions would you take to get back to work as quickly as possible?
Okay, interesting.
I know.
In case of layoffs,
it's a tough one.
that could actually happen, and it's a tough one.
And I'm pretending you quit so that we don't have to necessarily deal with the agony of layoffs. But
right, I would take a break for at least a couple of weeks to just clear my mind, right? Because if you have a lot of baggage, and again, this is just specific to me. This is not an advice that people should take a break. You asked me what I would do, so I'm just I'll probably take a break to clear my mind for a couple of weeks, not more than that. And after that, I will think carefully and ask question about what do I want to interview again for. Like, is it an engineering manager position? One good thing about tech and big tech is that there are always options of going back to being an individual contributor or continuing as a manager. And then I would, depending on, most probably it is going to be continue as an engineering manager. I would then kind of see that, okay, what experience do I have and what am I applying for? If I'm trying to up level myself, I'll have to make sure that I do have those data points, or I need to provide some evidence that people will interview me for the next level, right? Otherwise, I'll have to interview for the level that I have some examples for, so that I authentically kind of talk about my experience. And then I will shortlist again the companies that I think are better fit for me. Either want to continue in the big tech world, or do I want to switch gears and go to startups? It is important to know the expectations from those companies on both fronts. One is interview, because every company's interview process is going to be different. What they ask in interview is going to be different. For example, in big tech, even for managers, they ask, again, talking about technical stuff or technical aspect, managers, they ask coding questions, they ask system design, and then they ask behavioral. That may or may not be the case for startups, right? So if I'm focusing only on startups, and if I find out that they don't care about coding per se, I could save a lot of time in my preparation and then focus only on the stuff that matters. But on the other side, if the startups require me to have some hands-on experience, I would probably spend some time in building some side projects, which will give me again that experience of getting back hands-on, and I will have some evidence to show them that, hey, even though I was a manager and if I was not doing coding, here is the project I built on the side. So that way I will enrich my resume and I will do the preparation in terms of like focusing on where I want to apply. Especially in tech, it is practically impossible to cover everything. Hedge funds and high frequency trading firms will want something completely different, right? So you need to know your target market and where you are applying for. And then again, going back to the networking part, I'll try to see whether I have any network working in any of those industries, ask them about the opinion about the company, the interview process, any tips that they could offer. Hopefully my brand names will help me connect with the recruiters. But so if that's the case, I'll initiate the contact with the recruiters, even though I'm not interviewing tomorrow. Like I'll make my position clear that, okay, maybe in 1 month or time, but at least introductory calls. And then I'll gather basically as much information as possible, try to see what do I have, where is the gap, try to fill that gap. And when I feel I'm ready, you can't wait to feel ready to start applying. I will start applying a little before that because there's going to be some time. And sometimes you may never feel ready, right? There is always so much stuff to do. So even if I feel that, okay, maybe I'm like 70-80% of there, I will start applying.
Wow, that was so much amazing stuff. Very thorough for someone that had no idea I was going to ask that question. So thank you for that. I'm not going to comment on all the great stuff you said because there was so much of it, but I particularly liked the beginning of what you said because sometimes the beginning of what you said gets lost. So one, if you got fired or you got laid off or even if you quit, but you quit because you were really unhappy or having a lot of stress going on, that can kick up a lot of negative emotions. And I do think it is super important that people learn how to deal with that baggage, as you called it, or negative emotions. Now, maybe they don't completely go away, but if you spend some time actually processing them or going to therapy or talking about it with a close friend who understands what you're going through, because far too many people are rage applying and they're trying to conduct an effective job search, but they're angry or frustrated or sad. And so they don't, because they haven't dealt with that stuff, they don't realize they're not being very intentional, or they're making a lot of mistakes in the process, or their brain's not thinking creatively in terms of what they can be doing better. So I'm glad that you said this is what you would do, not necessarily what everybody should do, because I do think a break to process emotions is important. And for some people, 3 weeks might be too long. Because some people will just go on a vacation, never really deal with their emotions, and they're just prolonging a job search that could be way longer than they think. The second thing you talked about, also super important, you said you were going to get clear on what type of job that you were going to apply for, what job title, what level, what industry, what types of companies that you're clear on. Some people have been at their job search for 3 to 6 months and they still aren't totally clear. And they think that should be making their job easier. And it's actually making their job harder because they're not as strategic in their networking. They're not as strategic in the job descriptions that they're looking at. They're wasting way too much time looking at stuff that's not a good fit for them. And their argument in terms of what they're writing or what they're verbalizing is going to be diluted, or they're accidentally going to say something that doesn't apply for some of the positions because they're still too unclear on what they're applying for. So thank you so much for saying those things and all of the other steps. Please go back and pause that part of the recording and take notes on that, people, because there was a lot of good stuff in there. So Vineet, thank you so much for being here. I want to give you 30 to 60 seconds to share your closing or final thoughts for the people listening at home.
Sure. Yeah, I think I could do all that also, and this is a little bit different from what we have been discussing, but I think it's still connected, is making sure that you have 3 to 6 months of emergency savings buffer, right? Because once you know that, okay, you don't have to find a job in 30 days, that takes off a lot of pressure. And well, you could do that when you're employed to make sure that you reserve some buffer on the side so that you will have some time to kind of evaluate and think through all these situations. I totally get it. Like not everybody is going to be fortunate be in that position. But if you are employed, you could at least try to get in that position so that if the need arises, you are not kind of caught off guard or by surprise at that time.
Awesome. I love it. And any final thought for the audience as we wrap up?
I got into some of these companies on my second attempt. So don't lose hope, right? Like not everybody succeeds on the first try. There is no substitute for hard work, but you have to make sure that sometimes things don't go your way, but that is not a reflection of who you are as a person, right? So keep trying, keep building these relationships before you actually need it. And eventually the hard work will pay off.
That's amazing. That's such great advice to end it on. Normally I would have some closing thoughts, but that was so perfect. I'm actually going to end things here. Thank you so much for listening today. You were listening to the Career Success Secrets show. Vineet was our guest speaker today. If you have comments or questions about anything that we talked about, please include them in the comments, or please reach out to us so that we know what types of questions and what types of content you want to see in the future. Thanks for being here, everybody.